for joining us. I'll just quickly introduce the committee to Councilperson Hadden, who is the councilperson for the 49th Ward, which is, and welcome Councilmember Burns as well, which is the first jurisdiction in North America to do participatory budgeting. Alderwoman Hadden was not the alderperson at the time, but has certainly been deeply involved in participatory budgeting for years and years, and has a wide experience with this. On the call, Alderperson Hadden, of course, Mayor Daniel Biss, Matthew Orrin, who is our, you're one of our fellows. I forget the organization that you're with, but works for the city. Jonathan Newsma, who's council member of 4th Ward. David Stoneback, who is the, in normal times, the Director of Public Works, but our interim city manager. Now, Sarah Flax, who is our Housing and Community Development Coordinator. Am I getting that correct? Manager?
Housing and Grants Manager. That's okay. I do lots of things that aren't in my title.
Yeah. And then Councilmember Bobby Burns of the 5th Ward, who I think you're familiar with. All right, we will get started. On our agenda today, we have two items, but first we'll start with Councilmember Hadden, who is here to want to talk a bit about the 49th Ward PB process and maybe PB generally, and certainly take questions from this panel on questions that we have about implementing PB on the ground in a community that's roughly the size of Evanston, a little smaller than Evanston.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Happy to be here. Good to see you all as our neighbors to the north. I want to share just a little bit. So, really proud to serve as alderperson here in the 49th Ward, representing the community where, as Councilmember Reed said, we had our first North American, well, actually our first U.S. participatory budgeting experience. First North American would be in Toronto. So I was a participant in our first process, right, our first year, and then went on to join with Josh Lerner and Gianpaolo Baiocchi, and we started the Participatory Budgeting Project, a nonprofit organization where I worked for about 8 years. So in addition to kind of that participant experience, which I frequently reflect on, I've had the great pleasure of being an implementer. So for these implementation questions, I'll say I can probably give you, I'm going to have more of my perspective in answering your questions from an implementation perspective as not an older person, because I've had more years doing it as not an older person than as an older person. And then just to give you some other kind of idea of the kind of experience I hope I can offer in answering some of your questions, I managed our projects in the Midwest and Southern United States. So I did a lot of work with elected officials, but also public employees, so budget directors and county folks and city folks and community organizations. And most of my experience is in this initial stage, right? So how do you design a participatory budgeting process? What does engaging participatory design look like? Bringing residents into your process from the start. How do you determine kind of your values, your goals, and your mission for your project? Why are you doing PB? So helping people to think of the questions and figuring out the ways to answer those questions and working to design a process that's sustainable and engaging and meeting those goals is what my job used to be. So I've worked with folks in Jackson, Mississippi, and Greensboro, North Carolina, Denver, Colorado, Oakland, New York, and of course here all across Chicago. And then we've also done processes in schools. So I loved doing this work, and I'm very excited that Evanston is choosing to embark upon it. Other than getting better decisions around how to spend dollars, a lot of what you can achieve is creating these new connections with residents, building new and stronger relationships, right, between community and government. And I'll say, just going back to that first year of PB when Alderman Moore started PB here, I thought I was an engaged person, right? I voted, I read the paper, I volunteered at a community organization. And there was so much about how the city worked and things that were city responsibility or not the city's responsibility that I was very much unaware of. And I think now sitting in an elected space in government, and I'm sure everyone here, whether you're elected or an employee, can understand this, is that we know what we do, right? And we're immersed in it all the time. But there's so much that our constituents don't know, and a lot of complication and a lot of process. And volunteering and working with my neighbors in our first PB process, one, it felt like democracy to me, and it was a great opportunity. So it helped me to feel closer to my community. I met a ton of neighbors. And as you look at how we, especially in a time of the pandemic, find ways to build that social fabric, find ways to bring people more together around shared goals. This is a fantastic opportunity for you guys. So I'll stop speaking and just kind of open it up for questions that folks may have.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I will just ask one question and turn it over to the committee. You founded the Participatory Budgeting Project. Is that organization still in existence today?
Absolutely.
Oh, great.
Yes.
Okay.
So the Participatory Budgeting Project, you can find them at participatorybudgeting.org. They continue to do participatory budgeting work and working with different cities. They have offices in Brooklyn and in Oakland. We never had an office in Chicago. It was just me working out of my home, which made me very well suited for pandemic life, just saying. But they also work broadly in the space of not just participatory budgeting, but participatory democracy.
Great. All right, I will turn it over to the committee. I know Councilmember Newsome, you had a lot of really good process questions that I think are now suited for this meeting.
Oh, Councilmember, you're muted.
Apologies, I'm multitasking here on a critical email that just came in. And sure, our colleague
I apologize, I put you right on the spot.
The city of Chicago can sympathize with that.
I understand.
Yeah, well, okay, I will start off then. If no one else, or Matthew, also feel free, and Sarah or staff members who are going to be a part of implementing this, feel free to also jump in. So I'll start off with my first question. So we are, this is our third meeting, I believe, of the Participatory Budgeting Committee. And we have we have a minimum of 2.5 million roughly, and maybe up to 3.5 million is where things may fall. We're very early in the process. Where do you think we start with engaging residents, and what ability or what powers and duties do you think this initial committee should take on of council members and setting up the process, and what do you think is appropriate to delegate to the citizen committee as they begin the process? And I guess also wrapped up in that, how would you suggest going about forming that initial citizen committee?
Sure. Great questions. One, I think the best thing that this committee can do is establish what your kind of boundaries and legal boundaries and legal restrictions are. So kind of within your code, right? Within your legislation, what are you empowered to do? What are residents empowered to do with these funds? So big questions of like, what can the dollars be used for? What's the time frame that you need, right, to work within your budget? I'm not familiar with where the pot of money is coming from, but those are some of the things that are, let's say, not up for debate, right? Like, when do you need decisions by? Are there any restrictions on how the funds can be used? Are there any restrictions, like kind of legally that you're bound to on who can participate. So these are some of the things that I think, before you start engaging residents, you should have very clear and worked out. And I'll say that in the Chicago example, very clear cut, the funds that we have historically used for participatory budgeting it's bond money. So we can only use it for capital infrastructure on public spaces, and there are a lot of restrictions that are just built into the pot of money that we have. And that was something important for us to know and to have set. And then right from the bat, telling residents, we have $1 million, can only be used for these types of things. Having clear perspectives on which kind of government entities will be involved. So again, in the Chicago example, in most cities, your Office of Budget and Management, or whatever you call your department, right, is going to be there. As kind of a core piece, but also figuring out who's going to have the final say. Now, I'll say in Greensboro, North Carolina, where they do citywide PB, right? We worked with them on 3 cycles. They had $500,000, and they decided, right? The city decided they were going to split that amongst their 5 wards. So they had 5 districts. So they were going to do $100,000 per district. So those are questions structurally that you can decide with community, which I tend to favor deciding things with community. If there are some, in the case of Greensboro, that was what their city council approved, right? So before community members really got involved at a kind of committee level, certain city council members who were really skeptical of the process were like, hey, this is how we want it structured. So those were the parameters that their budget department, who ended up being the city employee implementers, had to work with. So those are some of the things, right? For Evanston, what are you able to do? What decisions do you have to make? And another example in kind of decision-making structures for Greensboro, the city of Greensboro, their city budget process, you have to think about this and where your funds are coming from. Theirs were coming from unrestricted funds within their kind of corporate budget for the city. And in that case, their process with the city manager was typically, I think their city manager creates a budget, right, presents it to council, council gives approval, city manager implements the budget. And so thinking about what's your decision-making structure on this particular budget, what's your time frame, and so then where's the most appropriate place for resident input? In the case of Chicago and doing ward PB with ward budgets, we have a time frame, right? The city wants decisions about what we call our menu funds by a certain time each year. It's usually around the beginning of March. But on the decision making, we work in constant consultation with our Office of Budget and Management, so that when we put together a ballot, nothing makes our ballot that isn't okay, right? Hey, we've vetted this. We know we can do it. We know it meets all these guidelines. Here are 10 projects that we can put on the ballot that, should they be selected, can be funded, can be implemented. They've already passed like kind of those tests, so that when we let residents then decide, it's whichever projects get the most votes until the funding runs out. So that's like a structural, when you think about the decisions, how that goes. I'll say
Alderman had a question about that process, if you don't mind. How do ideas get onto the ballot? Where do those ideas originate? Do those come from community members as well?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Or is it, are the nominations coming from other channels?
In every process that I've worked with, the ideas come from the community members. Community members could also be community organizations, right? So in a lot of citywide processes, it's like, hey, this organization that's already been rallying a group of people, right? Maybe it's a youth serving organization, maybe it's a school, right? So here in my ward even, it's really common for young people at our high schools to work with our office, and then think of a project that, hey, this is what the Sullivan High School project is going to be, or the CMSA High School project is going to be, and in other cities as well. So like, but they're still resident driven, coming from people directly. And then those projects, those after your idea collection, go through proposal development, right? So you work on your structure and your time frame of how do you prioritize projects, how do residents and your committees, usually it's a committee structure of volunteers, how do they figure out which projects to pursue and get more information on, and how much time do they need to turn those into proposals before they make a ballot?
Are there any guidelines on how small is too small, so you don't have a ballot with 250 different candidates?
It
Or
really,
maybe it is.
so it really depends. I'll say there are some process limitations that are built in. One of your process kind of, I'll say, limitations will be, how many volunteers do you recruit? Because you'll typically get a lot of people who suggest ideas, right? Hundreds of thousands of idea suggestions that can come in, but you're also working with community members to flesh out those ideas. So how many volunteers around the city are going to work on your committees to work with the city to turn these into proposals? That's a restriction. Timing is going to be a restriction. You guys probably know, let's say we take a project example of one of our projects that won last year were water safety signs at the beach. So that involved working with the park district. Long story short, the park district didn't have a vendor to buy the types of signs, right, that community members wanted, but the park district was willing to install signs that I purchased, right? If the city purchased them through our system, they're willing to do it, and then figuring out your implementation guidelines. But it took time, right? That took several weeks to get answers, to figure out, to go back and forth. And there's only so much time and attention. So I have not yet seen a process where people are overwhelmed by the number of projects on the ballot. Generally, it's the opposite of, well, we had 450 ideas, but maybe 30 of them made the ballot because of the amount of time we had. A lot of times community members will even try and group projects. And then the other thing that I'll throw out that this is usually a decision that's made during a participatory design process with your residents. So not just a government committee, but with your residents, is there are other filters you can put in. You can say, our goals for the process are to address climate change.
And I want to level set. We're talking about ARPA funds here. So I'm sure, this is all ARPA funding.
Right, you've got some restrictions there. So you can set goals and criteria around there too, that you want, that will also help residents and committee facilitators filter projects, right? Well, hey, this person wants to build a new water feature at this playground, and that's a great idea, and maybe a case could be made to do that. But, here are a dozen other projects that are more aligned with the goals or the funding restrictions that we have. So there's also a lot of good ideas that may not even be fully considered because there are other ideas that are more closely aligned with what your goals are.
Can I ask a question on this topic? You talk about the sort of like logistics and availability of time and stuff, kind of organically narrowing down this incredible number of ideas to a more manageable number of fleshed out projects. I would imagine there's a really tricky thing that happens there, right? So the whole point of this is to completely open up our spending decision-making process to the community, not hold it inside, perhaps, chip away at some of the suspicion and distrust people feel about how inside government decisions get made. And yet, of course, the only way to do that narrowing down process is to work directly with our staff and, take both their technical input and their just logistical input of what is and is not possible. And I would imagine that practically speaking, when that happens, there's some risk of, hurt feelings or kind of tension that emerges. I'm just wondering if you can share with us how real a concern that is and how you have seen that tension successfully managed.
Sure. So I'll give you an example of something new that we tried this year in our ward that actually resulted in a great example of like that not going well. So we worked with our friends at Great Cities Institute. I know you guys have heard from the director, Taya Crum, and who runs the PB Chicago program. And PB Chicago got funding and worked with a group and put together a fantastic digital platform that many of our wards here in Chicago used. Really great. Lots of people submitted ideas through the platform. And one of the things that in a best practice you do is everyone who submits an idea gets to figure out what happened to their idea, right? If they're not volunteering for a committee, there's some kind of paper trail. They know what happened to their idea, right? If you've got their contact information, so they can see where it's advanced or where it's not advanced. There's the possibility within this platform for staff to kind of go in the back end and give updates on things, or for committee members, right, our volunteers to do it. We weren't able to do that this year. So we had several residents who were upset. They were like, hey, I never heard what happened to my idea. And so that's an example of things that very commonly can happen, Mayor Viss. Some of the best practices, and when we've done it well, and we have said every project that gets submitted for consideration, like we have a log of it. So typically we have, in my office, we have an Excel spreadsheet, and my staff are the people who do the first pass of just, is this project eligible by the rules of the funding or ineligible? So that's like a category that we use. And we explain this right up front during all of our kind of community assemblies, the neighborhood assemblies. So we have capital restricted funds. If you want to fund a basketball program, that is just ineligible. So, you know, it goes in the ineligible list and it just doesn't go any further. And here's why. Now, how you collect ideas, whether you get contact information for people, is another process choice. A lot of times in previous years when we're doing things in person or we're having collection drop boxes at the library or something, you don't always get contact information, but we like to publicly share it, right? So if you think about a website or a platform where after idea collection, you can just show people without contact information, hey, here's the 1,000 ideas we got. Here are the 200 that are eligible based on these guidelines for ARPA funds. And these are the ones that are going to go for in the committee. Once projects get into the committee, we have project forms for those residents, and we give them criteria on which to evaluate. So here in Chicago, we ask them to evaluate impact, to evaluate equity, and to evaluate need in our communities. So thinking about at the ward level, it's easy, and you could apply this to your city level, but, you know, hey, there's a proposal here for, you know, doing streetlight improvements, you know, around the ward and maybe in this specific area. So we'll ask residents to look at, well, find out when's the last time those streetlights were improved, right? Here's some factual information. Maybe go take some pictures. What do those streetlights look like? Are they the new kind, the old kind? What can we assess? You know, from the office, they could ask us, you know, where are the other hot spots in the area, right? Where we get 311 complaints about darkness or not a lot of light. And so that conversation gives them information. And we actually have a tool that we've used with PB Chicago. It's literally a little point system, right? It's almost like what you might do with an RFP, but it's a simplified system of letting people score them. And we ask them to score, like fill out a project proposal form for everyone. There's a paper trail. Every project that's eligible gets considered. How do you score it? Great. Pick the top 10. And that's how we might ask people to then work on which ones they'll do a deeper dive into. And so figuring out what your process would be, something similar and clear that everyone follows, helps, because that's the fairness that people are going to look for. Because again, if people feel like a process isn't fair, they're not going to participate in it again. But that's one of the ways that is a best practice that a lot of processes use of everything gets considered, everything gets documented. And if anyone chose to say, hey, where did my idea go? We should be able to have a piece of paper or digital documentation to say, here's why that didn't proceed. And, you know, here you go.
we're going to be challenged to clarify eligibility guidelines up front, since we're using ARPA funds, which are fairly restricted. And that's a hard enough question for staff to answer, let alone council, let alone the general public. So I don't have an easy answer here, but that is a definite challenge that we're going to have to kind of pre-screen ideas before they even get submitted. So we're not obligated to respond back to every idea that people have if it's not ARPA eligible.
Yeah, definitely.
My thought is that with ARPA and the clear guidelines, sometimes that makes that process a bit, well, I mean, Sarah, you can maybe opine more on how clear and not clear, but I think the guidelines are fairly, with the new rule, the final ruling, fairly clear at this point and fairly flexible. But I think that actually makes the job easier because we know this is either eligible or ineligible kind of off the bat and can kind of really separate the wheat from the chaff.
And I think that there are potential goals that we can set around the goals of ARPA, which I think actually align very well with our community goals in some ways. And that is helping, I mean, ARPA, you can do lots of things, but you can do certain things only when you show you are helping a disparately impacted community, which is largely easily defined as low income and people of color. And there's also a thing that a mapping tool that came out from the White House to show geographic areas that they have identified as potentially, to be focused on for ARPA because of the income and all that sort of stuff. So we might even have, it would be possible to consider certain geographic areas, especially if we were looking for certain type of capital things, to kind of, and then there are certain things like, I'm just going to throw out some things that everybody's been talking about, like mental health needs that actually went from being focused on disparately impacted groups in the interim rule to being like, no, whoever needs it in the final rule, because I think they realized by that time that the stress is on everybody. So, did you ever see breaking into like, here is a sort of capital fund area, and it might be for certain geographic areas or for certain specific needs, like one of our CARP goals is retrofitting in housing for lower income people that is, that type of thing. So I'm just throwing out some ideas about, and some of these things we're talking about regardless of whether it comes through participatory budgeting. So I'm not saying those have to be out of participatory budgeting, but I'm trying to give examples of, do you see that as being a way of helping focus and maybe manage to some extent? And one of the challenges about federal funding is small amounts of money are very hard to manage. And so we might end up with a different type of budget threshold just because,
Right.
we have to track everything and show the federal government and have source documents and stuff. It's kind of like, there's a point where we'll just, so maybe we try to do something like impact from a standpoint of how many people are going to be helped or something, so that we end up focusing. But we also may have longer term that we can look at, because we have until December 31st, 2024 to obligate funds, which means we have to have a concrete written agreement of how it's going to be expended by then.
All this underscores to me is we need to set up a process that's manageable.
Yes.
And it's not going to be, all encompassing to offer everybody everything they might conceivably want. And if you have a Sarah Flax level knowledge of detail of the ARPA funding, then we can leave it up to you to decide if a project is or is not eligible. And even then, there might be some interpretation disagreement. And so, although the rules and guidelines do exist, they don't exist in a way which is manageable and digestible for effective public engagement without any further kind of touch from our committee. So as we move forward, we're going to have to be really darn clear as to what we are asking the community to suggest to us and what those guidelines are. And that may involve limiting the money that we're running through participatory budgeting to just one or two of the eligible ARPA buckets, just to make it a manageable process.
One thing I'll share, and I'll say, I've worked with countless cities where people have these like completely reasonable concerns, and also starting from a place where you're already kind of restricting is going to limit where you can go with this, and it's also going to make your program less attractive to your residents. You don't, if I'm a resident suggesting an idea, I do not have to know what the ARPA fund restrictions are. One of the great things, and that I would recommend, and just for clarification of like a best practice and process, is it's not your volunteers who are deciding what's eligible or ineligible. It is your staff, right? It's Sarah, it's Matthew. Those are the people who are going to make those decisions. Hopefully, in your process, it's an opportunity for a lot of civic education. I'll say, I very much recall sitting through my first neighborhood assembly, and capital stuff is pretty cut and dry. So that's one of the reasons why we see a lot more instances in the US around that. It was very clear, a PowerPoint presentation with like a little X that would pop up and like a sound, right? Like this is here's examples of ineligible or eligible. And it did make it really clear. So Councilmember, you're 100% correct on like, on the public front, like when you guys finally have something that you're ready to introduce to people, clear, simple. You don't need it to be complicated. It doesn't have to be a whole background education on ARPA, but it can be, right, on a kind of a side piece for folks who are interested. But having like your trusted staff who can manage the information is going to be key. But for residents, you can just say, hey, we're doing a PB process and we want ideas that are going to, benefit the most number of Evanstonians, that are going to help people who've been disproportionately impacted by COVID, and that align with whatever XYZ our kind of city priorities are from our city plan that we've got. You can make it as simple as that, but then you guys are still the ones who are filtering and kind of saying, okay, well, this project meets our federal guidelines. You might consider, to Sarah's point, again, with the federal processing, you might consider things like minimum project sizes. So again, a lot of our projects are capital, and so we don't have to worry about that. Capital projects are always very expensive. But if you are going to open it up to programmatic things, which is also something they do in New York City, so in PBNYC, they do programmatic things, but sometimes they do have stipulations of must be at least, $100,000 or $50,000. Again, to Sarah, your point of making sure that it's efficient.
I do think that we're not expecting the community to become ARPA experts, but we do need to provide the community some information to guide them in the right direction, so they're not giving us 150,000 ideas that there's no way we can consider, and they'll feel excluded from the process because we're shooting half of the stuff down.
Have you all checked out some of the websites from PBNYC or PB Oakland, from the youth process in Boston? They have a lot of great information, videos, examples, materials. I don't know if you guys have had the opportunity to kind of look into those, because it's really nice to see at this point, it's 12 years into PB in the US, you guys are in really good company with a lot of folks who have answered a lot of these really tough questions and have a lot of great examples. But I'd really recommend checking out some of their websites for some of the video and information, especially the Boston process, Youth Lead the Change. So they were the first citywide PB process that was youth focused. So there, they let all the residents in the city were able to suggest ideas. and volunteer on committees, but the only people that got to decide and vote were young people. So they already had kind of a great youth leadership program and like a mayor's youth council, and they had a structure and infrastructure for that. But when you think about how to make things easily understood, young people are really good at doing that. So some of their materials like could help give you some ideas of how did they explain, how did Boston teenagers explain this process to other teenagers and adults?
Let's talk about minimum project size for a second. And I think on Monday we approved $3.5 million for participatory budgeting.
Mm-hmm.
So simple math, if we said the minimum project size was $50,000, that means 70 projects. Sarah, Director Stonebeck, 70 projects seems like a fairly big number for staff to be able to effectively manage. Understanding that if 50 is the minimum, there might be one project that's 1.3 million, and we're probably not going to have 70 projects. But I'd be interested to hear some feedback from staff as to the number of projects that are approved by this. Like, what do you have the bandwidth to manage?
And that's a tough one because I mean, I'm going to say certain infrastructure things, for example, might be done by city. And then it's a question of, Dave and his, I'm just going to make one up, like sidewalks in areas where we don't have sidewalks because walking is healthy, helps people avoid COVID, that type of thing. And so we know that making our city more walkable is a goal. So how would that play into it, and how could that be done by the city? I mean, we've got to manage that way. And then when we do think about social services, then we're likely working with social service providers in most cases, trying to figure out what they can provide. So, I'm kind of like, I guess I need to look at, I think you said New York is doing that. So maybe we kind of need to see what type of thing they're doing, because that would maybe help me figure out what might be manageable.
If I could interrupt, Sarah, for the council members on the phone, regardless of city, do you guys anticipate something as concrete as, if it's sidewalks, for instance, we have $100,000, that will get us, Dempster Street between, Wesley and Dewey, and we're voting on that specifically, as opposed to $100,000 for the sidewalk fund?
I think it would be on the project specifically, on doing these streets specifically, not just for the sidewalk fund.
That was, that's how I was looking at it.
Yeah, but to Councilmember Hadden's point, I think if there are, let's say there's 3 or 4 or 5 different sidewalk projects that come in, and they're each $100,000, you could group all of those together as one large, $500,000,
Right.
sidewalk project, and vote on that entire bucket at the same time.
So as we're kind of brainstorming this collectively here, I would like to look to existing VCCs who are already having ARPA conversations and ask them for projects, ask them for their suggestions, nominations for the participatory budgeting ballot.
Well, yeah, I thought they'd participate as. Go ahead, Councilmember Brown.
Yeah, in addition, I'm not to shortcut citizen input directly, not at all, but we do have citizens on these BCCs, and taking input from those groups, I think we would definitely not want to rule that out. We would want to encourage that.
Councilmember Burns.
Yeah, I was going to say that we, certainly want to make sure the process is manageable. But for me, the most important thing is that this is attractive to residents, and particularly residents that don't currently participate in government in any way. That's the group that I really want to serve with this process. And so I just want to keep that on the forefront of our mind as we design this. And then lastly, I just want to emphasize that we are not. The good thing about this is we're not alone. as Councilmember Haddon said, there are many examples of other cities and schools doing this. And so, although it feels new and uncertain to us, I think we're a phone call away from getting somebody in New York and other areas to hop on a call with us and to say, "Oh no, we had that same concern, and here's how we addressed it." So again, I know it's new for us, but you know, this is good information. But understand that we're a phone call away from likely all of these questions that have been posed today having very clear and specific answers that can relieve some of the uncertainty that we're feeling now. Thank you.
If I can just quickly jump in for time management, I do want to keep us on time here. So I think the RFP discussion shouldn't be more than 5 to 10 minutes unless there's real big concerns. So we'll have like 5 or 10 more minutes for this discussion. But
I just wanted to raise a possibility and just get your thoughts on this too, Maria. I mean, we have a pot of money, but it doesn't mean we have to necessarily try to do all of it at once. We could break it into chunks and maybe kind of, I don't know if that's a good thing, if anybody's done that. Like, do you ever do a kind of pilot, or have you seen any organization or any city or community try to do that in stages? In many cases, it's probably tied to like a budget year, and ours isn't that way. So I'm wondering if that gives us a little different consideration, you know.
You're right. It gives you a little bit more freedom. Some things that and this is again implementation hat. PB does take a lot of work and time and resources. I would, if you were to think about the flexibility that you're not tied to a budget cycle. One, if I were you, I would map out, when does your budget cycle look like kind of happen, right? This isn't me asking, but map that out really, of like, when are council members' attentions focused on the city budget? When are city resources and things? So think about kind of the resource allocation, community focus, and attention. You could use this process that's running kind of parallel. You could still time it on something in order to amplify, engage people around that process. Or you could say, we don't want to do it during this time frame because it'll be confusing, right? And we want to do something over a different time frame. So those are some considerations. I'll say, if you check out the city of Durham, North Carolina, so Durham has the largest PB process in North Carolina. And this is my favorite thing that I'm going to keep pushing in Chicago. They do theirs with city funds, but they move to a 2-year budget cycle. Like, isn't that a dream? I'm like, why don't we decide this every year? We could do it every 2 years. And that's not just for PB. That's like their city budget, right? There's so few things that really change year over year. They do a 2-year budget cycle, which means that thinking about an implementation dream is having more time to do one process and to do it well. So I would caution against doing multiple processes, like, hey, let's do a pilot and then let's try and do this. You could try it, but I'll say that, think about what the cost benefit is to that, right? How do you decide the funds? Like, what's the capacity of staff? How much time does it take to do things? Because it does take a lot of effort, right, to do the necessary outreach, to get people excited, to get people engaged, and to keep them engaged cycle after a cycle. So I'd put that as a consideration. But knowing that you do have a more generous time frame, you've got time to do it well, right? And you're not as restricted. One thing I'll offer, you can check out the city of Cambridge as well. They're probably a good example of a more similar size citywide process. And then as you look to program costs, programmatic things, a lot of the examples from NYC did come from existing organizations. But that was a benefit. And to Councilmember Burns's point, that also helped to get a lot of residents engaged who weren't normally engaged, right? So a notable project, I forget which district it was at NYC, but from a few years ago, it was one of their health centers that got mobile, like a mobile medical van, right? It's fantastic. It was serving a particular community that really needed it. And this nonprofit health center was able to get this mobile medical van. And now this was a great PB project. They engaged folks. There was another one, a community center getting like a new ultrasound machine. Right. A lot of great people who get involved around their schools. So thinking about those things, a community center or organization or kind of institution can be a great partner in activating a lot of residents who may not be directly connected to government, but that are like, oh, this is like, the place that does my kids, Little League baseball team. And I didn't even know about this, but now they're getting me engaged. This is where I go to, apply for services, right? This organization's always helping me. And now they're letting me know about this process. And I have an idea, or maybe they have an idea they're engaging me with. So it can open up a lot more doors than infrastructure projects do to reaching residents.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah, thank you. I want to make sure I'm keeping the floor open for either Mary Biss, Matthew, or Director, Interim Deputy Manager Stoneback. But otherwise, I have one question as well. I am curious. So, are in the processes that you have seen, either in as a council member yourself or in your work, is there space for council members, for members of this body, for example, to get proposals on the ballot as well? So, for example, let's just say, for example, we have an ask that is going to come before the council for $1 million for a community hub called the Ops, an entrepreneurship hub. Is that something? Have you seen processes where councils or whatever the governing body has placed an item on the ballot kind of unilaterally as just one of the options? And would you recommend against that, or are you?
I haven't seen it. I don't think we've had as many opportunities with the types of budgets that at least our US experiences have gone to. And my first reaction is like, no, don't do that, right? But I'll say, I think that specifically with ARPA dollars, there might be some interesting opportunities for it. The thing that you'll want to guard against is, you guys know, attaching things to elected officials, right? It can become problematic and become political. There are a lot of things there, but maybe things that are initiatives of different departments, that's really common. So I'll say it's very common in especially citywide PB processes to ask like the different department, because residents want to know, like, hey, we want to do this thing. Do you have a wish list? Oftentimes departments do have ideas maybe to address certain issues. They've been, taking the same request from residents for like a decade. But they haven't had the budget right to do it, or when they put that item, the city manager cuts it out because there's not the funding for it. So I've definitely worked with processes where departments have been asked, like, what's a thing that you've really wanted to do to address this community issue, but we haven't had the funding for, and then them going through the same process of being able to kind of present and stand up their ideas.
I think that would be analogous to my suggestion that boards and commissions should be able to nominate projects. Question, Alderman Haddon, when items do go on the ballot, is the name of the nominator attached to them?
We recommend against that. So generally ballot items are anonymous. And this is going to come to some specifics of different places, of scale, right? Of kind of who's involved in your process. It's really easy at a local level, and even at a smaller city level, to just like, the projects usually get done by a committee. So maybe I, Maria Haddon, submitted an idea at the beginning to put more showers at the beach parks, right? To make it easier for me to not have sandy kids get back in my car, right? Maria Haddon's idea, that's what I want to see. But that project, once deemed eligible by a city person who says, okay, we can use funds for this, that goes to a committee. And a committee of residents, right, kind of look through that, and they decide whether they're going to champion it. Now, I might join that committee and I might be a big champion of it, but at the end of the day, if it passes muster and it makes the ballot, it's a ballot that's come from that Parks Committee, right? Or the Recreation Committee.
Right.
It doesn't come from
It's
Marina.
not your idea when people are voting on it.
Mm-hmm.
That's helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Any further questions for Councilmember Hadden?
I just have
All right. Sorry,
just a quick one. In your experience working as part of the participatory budgeting project, when you were working with cities, can you just give an estimate of what sort of staffing requirements for the city you saw and how big of a role you played as well?
I'll give you an example. So for the last full city I worked with was Greensboro, and comparable. They're a bit larger than Evanston, right? But still a typical budget, and this might change with inflation a little bit, but we kind of recommend for, hey, outreach and materials and kind of cost to look at like $1 per resident, right? For kind of material program cost. For staffing for like the city of Greensboro, we really recommended 2 staff. And so in the model, and this is still, if you talk with the participatory budgeting project, this is still the model they do. You might have a project coordinator who works for them, but they really push people to have local people be their staff. So like we might fundraise or work with the city through a contract to maybe manage or guide or train people, but ultimately they're not like people that the PB project hires. There would be local Evanston people, right, that get this contract to do this work and engage with the city. But yeah, you know, two staffers, you know, full-time equivalents is really helpful and has been, at least for 3 years in Greensboro, worked pretty well on kind of managing and interfacing. And again, thinking and some considerations will be, are these people who are external to the city of Evanston? Is this in addition to internal staff? Who will be a liaison? In that Greensboro example, we had 2 staff members from Greensboro that were hired, and then we had a liaison with the budget department internal to the city. So there's a few different options. There's no one right way, but yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. This is all, and thank you, Matthew, for that question. This is all extremely helpful, and I think this is. I think I've come out with a clearer roadmap than we've had before. So thank you, Alderperson Hadden, for joining us and giving this testimony.
Fantastic. Good luck, and don't be a stranger.
Certainly.
Oh, look out. We won't be. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Fantastic. Have a good evening.
Yes, you too.
Bye.
Yeah, that was helpful. I think in our next meeting we can come back with the beginnings of a plan, and maybe we'll hold off one meeting, and maybe Matthew and I and whoever else wants to get, or we can just have that meeting and really start working on the plan in 2 weeks together. Okay, moving on. May I have a motion for the second item, which is to approve the RFP, which seems pretty straightforward, seems pretty boilerplate.
I'll make that motion, Mr. Chairman.
So moved by Councilmember Nusma, seconded by
Me.
Mayor Biss. Okay, is there any discussion regarding the RFP?
Blanks to be filled in, right? Of course.
Yeah, there's yeah. So Matthew, did you need direction on those blanks, or? I mean, it's just, I think mostly dates that would coincide with us approving here.
Yeah, so there are just some, right, like you said, Councilmember Nusma, some blanks that need to be filled in, but mostly what I was hoping was maybe any comments on the scope of services, if there were any things like that, if you all saw something that you think should be there that isn't, or things that are there that you don't think should be there.
I don't have a ton of Director Stoneback. If you're able to pop in, I just honestly don't have a ton of RFP experience, and so my after going through it, what I do wonder is, given that there are only a few entities that perform this work, can we make the RFP a bit less formal and just a bit simpler? I don't know if that's.
It's my understanding that to comply with ARPA funding requirements, that we have to use our standard,
Okay.
Procurement protocol, and we are using the standard procedure in this request for proposal.
Okay. Well, that was my only question about it and concern. Is there anything else? I'm sorry, Matthew, if you want to, anything else you want to direction on?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I have been working with Dave on this, on getting it sorted out. So yeah, if you all think it looks okay, then we can move forward on it then.
Okay. Great then. May I have a roll call? Councilmember Nusma.
Aye.
Councilmember Burns.
Aye.
Mayor Biss. Aye.
Aye. There we
Yes. And then myself, aye. The ayes have it. All right. Then if I just want to very quickly recap, what do folks think? Our next meeting, is it beginning to figure out the actual structure of the citizen committee? Is it just more so figuring out the staff requirements and a timeline, or what do you, where do you think we are now, and what's our next brick to lay? Do we still need more information? I mean, obviously we're waiting to see what we receive from the RFP. Likely that would be in, I guess, a month from now, maybe, if we can shed a.
Yeah, I guess that's the question: is what conversations do we not want to have until that is resolved? Certainly, my instinct is that we're ready to talk about a lot of different aspects of this. But if we want to wait until we have some sort of partner secured, I would understand that too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Sarah and Dave and Matthew as well. Do you think? I think this is one of the blanks in there, was how long folks would have to return, a proposal. What's the shortest, reasonable time frame for us to both have it ready to go out and then to solicit the responses from the 3 entities that we know about?
I think that once we turn it into purchasing, that they'll take a week before they will advertise it. I think that purchasing will require at least 2 weeks for the people to prepare a response.
Okay, so then it seems that if we were to meet, so I guess the question is, do we skip our next meeting and just meet a month from now when we have responses to the RFP, or do we have a meeting in between, which would be just following the normal schedule?
I personally think a month is fine if staff has the capacity to do additional research. So we've heard a lot today, and there's a lot of questions we can get answered by reaching out to other jurisdictions who are doing this work. I can think of several, questions that I would have for people who actually, run PB processes. So as long as that research is happening in between this meeting and the next meeting, I think we can, hold off a month, and we can send questions that we may have to whoever. I don't know if it's Sarah or whatever staff member is paying point on this. We can all send our questions to them and get an update in a month.
Yeah, I think to me and Matt is what I would assume, to send the questions to Matt and I, and then we'll dole it out. Yeah, and I also have to run to another meeting as well.
Yeah, if Matt can coordinate them, that would be great. And then maybe Matt, you and I can talk about just research from the information that the council member gave us on communities to look at, that we can start maybe doing some additional stuff on that.
Okay, so then we'll meet in a month, and we'll have the RFPs to review, and we will I guess maybe have one more presentation from folks that are out of town doing it to answer some more questions, and I think we'll be ready to start rolling from there.
Great.
Okay, if that makes sense. All right. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.
everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.